welcome. Thanks all for joining. Good to be back.
Buongiorno, everybody.
We have Vittorio here as well. Plan for today, we're going to talk about, catch you up on what's been going on in the world of OAuth. That's been, it's been a while since we've done one, and we've since had our first in-person meeting of the OAuth group in like 2 years. So yeah, that's exciting. So yes, what do you want to talk about today, Vittorio?
Well, Elon, I'm hearing, is about to buy Twitter. But yeah, we'll worry about the identity implications when and if that happens. For the time being, I share your excitement for finally, after 2.5 years, we finally met in this special flavor IETF. Like IETF normally is pretty large events, like 1,000 and a half. Instead of this time, we were 400, 300, but still the spirit was there, and it was such a breath of fresh air to be able to keep flogging dead horses of identity, even at dinner, instead of just Zoom if it starts and ends, and then you just go on with your day. So it was fantastic. Yes, let's talk about it.
Yes, exactly. All right. Yeah, I know the last time we met in person, I believe, was Singapore 2019. Is that right? November?
Which I skipped. The last one I did in person was in Montreal.
Yep. I did go to the one in Singapore and did not know that was going to be the last trip for so long. So yeah, it was nice to be back, and it was a smaller group in person in the meetings, but I felt like we had a really good turnout of the OAuth group anyway.
Yeah. For OAuth, it clearly people had pent up things to talk about, and in fact, not only we had like a decent number, but the agenda was packed, and we used all the time available, and then we had overage time. And then we had all the social moments in which, between laughs and drinks, we talked shop the entire time. So it was, for Identity Geeks, it was a fantastic 5 days.
For Identity Geeks is a very good way to caveat that, yes. Yeah, so this was the few days we had. We had 2 formal sessions on the schedule and 2 official side meetings, which are the way this works is the groups get 1 or 2 slots, usually 2 hours, 2-hour slot on the schedule during the week at the IETF. And that's actually one of the reasons that, not being in person, the OAuth group and a few others I heard kind of switched to just doing interim meetings and not trying to cram everything into the 1 week, because it's hard to schedule that many meetings across that many different groups, and a lot of people have overlap in multiple groups they participate in. And with everything being virtual, there's not a lot of benefit to cramming everything into a week. So a lot of the groups were just switching to interim meetings, just doing it throughout the course of the year. And that worked really well for virtual. I think it worked a lot better virtually, frankly. But there is a lot of value to being in person, condensed into a week. And so yeah, we had 2 slots on the schedule of the 2-hour meetings, and then we had 2 side meetings, which basically meant there was a room booked for a certain time, and it was not necessarily a planned agenda, and it was not recorded, and it was not necessarily minuted in the same detail, but it was a time that was published on the schedule, and people knew that there were going to be conversations happening there. Those were also
very color for that. That room had microphones for, like, there was like these horseshoe shape table, and there were microphones for each place. And those microphones had like a sequencing in which when you would take the mic, you would proactively disconnect anyone else who was talking. And so it was funny to see the various different personalities that would actually forcibly interrupt people so that they could get their bit in. I will let you guess in which category Aaron and myself belong to. We are not going to reveal. But it was a fun moment of color that you would not get if you'd be online. And it was fun.
I thought that was it was interesting. Honestly, that room was too big for the group that we had. But it was really funny. It was the mics you see at those at government panels and stuff, where it's like everybody has their little box with a little stick pointing up and a big red light showing you who's on. And yeah, I don't think anybody realized what was happening at first, but like as soon as you would press the button to say something, it would shut off whoever else was talking. It would just, and because the room was so big, you could only really hear whoever was mic'd. So it was a very effective way of just being like, my turn. So yeah, let's jump into seeing what was on the schedule for the first session. We had 4 topics on the agenda. So chairs update. That's just administrative work, right? Nothing significant really. I think it was some status updates on some of the drafts in terms of where they are in the sort of post-working group life cycle of working their way through the rest of the machine. And
then a couple of victory laps for things that since the last time we met became RFCs, and it's a notable accomplishment, so it deserves a moment of public acknowledgement. But yeah,
also true. Yep. I think your draft was one of those, right?
It should have been, but I think that it was approved before the last virtual one, so it wasn't mentioned. It was mentioned during the virtual one. Like this time, we mentioned I think the issuer draft that was like the fastest RFC in history, and there was another one which now escapes me.
Well, it's probably in the minutes, right?
That's possible, but as we can follow up.
9207, that one is issuer, right?
I think it's the issuer, yeah.
Yeah, and then JSON Web Token response is in the queue. Thumbprint URI rich authorization request security BCP have consensus but are pending write-ups by the chairs. So there we go.
And also, in particular for the security BCP, things did happen during IETF.
Yes. I feel like this is a draft that is just keeps going. It just keeps giving. And at some point, we have to just draw a line and finish it, even though it's not like the security of the space won't keep evolving. So, but yes, we'll get there.
Yeah, you're right. We needed to get a snapshot of the state today. And I think that at this point, we are reasonably close. Let's say that there was this one last controversy, which I believe has been ironed out, also thanks probably to the high bandwidth conversation we had in Vienna. So I'm confident that Daniel Fett will soon be able to rest and have this thing finally out.
Yep. So the first draft we actually talked about was Depop, which we have mentioned quite a few times on this channel before, because it is also been around for a while and gone through quite a number of changes. This has been worked on since 2019.
Yeah, and I think
into the group in 2020.
We were both in the place where it was born. It was in Stuttgart.
I wasn't at that
we
one.
were doing the OSW, and someone came up with the idea, and then this uncommonly numerous group of authors decided to put it together, and here we are.
Yeah. That reminds me of, I think one of the first items on the agenda for this document was a comment about the number of authors of this draft. Correct.
It was unusually high, and so Roman mentioned that Roman is the area director, mentioned that it's unusual, and some people might frown at it, but that he was willing to make the case for all those offers if everyone felt that they should have been all those offers. And I think that Brian was presenting, Brian Campbell, and basically confirmed that, yes, they all had significant contributions, so they should all be in the offer. And so we are keeping the plan of record, and they are still there. However, I'm realizing now that we are doing the classic mistake of identity people. Like we are just assuming that everyone that is tuned know what the Depop is. So my suggestion is let's use one sentence to describe what that thing is. And if I might suggest one, Depop is an extension to OAuth, which allows you to use tokens by proving the possession of one particular key, which eliminates many of the shortcomings that you have in classic OAuth, in which tokens are better tokens. Better tokens are tokens that can be used just because you own the bits of those tokens. Hence, they are vulnerable to many of the middle attacks or any attack that leaks the token. But with Depop, you have a mechanism for negotiating a key and using a key to protect part of a message, so that if a token and the message get intercepted, the best you can do is to replay exactly the same message. But if you want to use that token to send another message, you can't. That's the most concise way I can think of. What do you think, Aaron?
Yep. I think that's a great description. I will just add, it is one of a couple of different attempts at this problem. So it is specifically created for being able to be used by single page apps, whereas some of the other options are not necessarily possible or are very difficult. So that's the specific thing it's targeting, but it can be used by any app that can handle a private key.
And shameless plug, we have one episode of the Identity Unlocked podcast in which Brian Campbell goes into the details of Depop, of MTLS, and this space in general.
Yep. Yes, I remember that one. Also very good. Oh, it looks like Brian is also here. Do you have a comment, Brian?
Do you want to say something?
Other than just a general sigh of exasperation. Anyway, yeah. So the what happened with this draft during the meeting? It seemed like it was mostly a status update. There were a couple of little details to be worked out, but I don't remember there being a lot of discussion.
Yeah, it was quite uncontroversial, and I remember being very happy with it because the last few times there were some discussions at the fundamental level, like should we be able to use symmetric keys, or should we be giving guidance that assumes stuff inside the token rather than just being generic in respect to how the access token is encoded. But none of that happened this time. This time it was a smooth sailing. And in fact, at the end of the meeting, the chairs made the working group last call on Depop. So usually a very good indication that we are within a line of sight of the finish line.
Yep. I think that's great. That's right. And I remember that it was scheduled for 45 minutes. And if I remember correctly, finished well under the amount of time scheduled for it, which has been unusual for that draft in particular in past meetings.
Very true.
Yeah. So here's a question about this. Great question from No Name, who ironically I have seen on this channel before. So No Name is a name in itself. Single page apps without a backend can't handle private keys, but if we have a backend, why not use it as a proxy combined with the code flow? So good questions. Two things. Single page apps can handle private keys, which is I guess, relatively recent development in browsers, but there is the Web Crypto API. And that API lets the browser generate non-exportable private keys that the browser can then use to sign things with. So that's the idea, is leveraging that mechanism in the browser to be able to do things with private keys so that we can have a lot better security. And non-exportable being the key there because, no pun intended, the key. the non-exportable, meaning that then if you have an attacker who is able to get JavaScript into your app for some reason, that attacker's JavaScript also can't extract the private key because your code also can't. So that's great. More things should use that. However, there aren't a lot of good, well-established patterns for using that yet, which this is supposed to be one of them. So I'm excited to see that happen.
And on the second part of that question, which is why not using the backend as a proxy, that is not always trivial. Let's say that it depends on what you're doing on your backend. Like for just having the backend is not like a 0-1. You can have a backend but not have a full control over the code that runs over it. Or you might want to limit the amount of computation there because it's expensive. Or you might have APIs that are geolocated, and having to go through your backend would force you to embed that advanced logic to deal with that considerations. In general, and also you might have your workforce, which mostly work with JavaScript, and so proxying everything would be expensive, both from money and from the functionality performance perspective, and also it might just not be the way in which your developers operate. So there are a large number of practical reasons for which just the fact that you're running some code on the backend might not allow you to do everything on the backend, because everything you do in there has implications, especially at a large scale, which is one of the reasons for which with Brian, a couple of years ago, we suggested the thing like a hybrid between doing everything in JavaScript and doing everything in the backend. It's a bit of a back burner, but eventually it will come back.
Yeah, and then I guess one other thought on that is, yes, a backend, there's generally less risk of a token leaking from some sort of server-side system compared to a single-page app. So that's why it's very common to use bearer tokens from server-side apps, both as an access token, but also a client secret where it's a shared secret. It's very common because there's a much less risk of a token leaking that way compared to a mobile app or a single-page app. However, there's not no risk, and sometimes that risk is still too much for someone, and they still want to use a sender constrained token, even though it's server-side code. And I believe the security BCP talks about some of the more concrete examples of why you may want to do that. But like one example, and obviously these don't apply to everybody because it's very much dependent on your architecture and how many different things you have, moving parts you have, which is why not everybody cares about it. But one example would be if you have a bunch of different resource servers and one of them maybe you don't trust as much for some reason. So a client is sending an access token to a resource server. The resource server then has the bearer token, and that resource server could use it to go access things in other APIs because it has the token. And if you want to prevent that from being possible, you can't use a bearer token anymore. You have to do something else. So that's another reason to add in that sender constraint. You're laughing. Do you have an example of this?
Laughing is more of like I'm having traumatic memories that are coming back as you describe this, because this is at the core of the controversy about the audience of access tokens, because there is the camp that suggests that the access tokens should be like a wide spectrum artifacts that can be used with multiple resources, whereas there are others, and I'm in that camp, that suggests that the audience should be as specific as possible. And then whenever the client needs to call a different resource server, you should just be able to use a refresh token to ask for a different token on the fly, so that you reduce the blast radius. Now, the thing that you are describing is a potential justification to be more on the other camp, because at that point, even if you don't have an audience that protects you with the specificity of the use of a leaked access token, you can just prevent the leak or make the leak non-actionable from the attacker. So potentially you can reduce the traffic and have less tokens in your cache and less need to hit the token endpoint with a refresh token. So this is another way in which having a viable sender constraint mechanism is a game changer. Because like already today, there is MTLS, which is already an RFC, and things like FAPI, the financial APIs, demand it. They say if you want to be compliant with our stuff, you must do it. But it's hard. Like it has a lot of considerations about the edge, SSL terminators, all of that stuff. Once we'll have Depop, we'll be able to use it in ways that in the past we've been solving differently, like with the audiences. So I'm really looking forward for this thing to be officially done and published.
Yep. Yeah, great questions. Let's move on to the next one. Let's see. That was redirection attacks. This was something that Rafat brought up, who he is the chair, so he had to step away from his chair duties to present this. This is not a draft. It was a topic of discussion. So looking through the minutes, he did present some slides, but the core of it, if I remember correctly, was the idea that there's several places in the OAuth specs that say to redirect if an error has occurred of some sort, and there is a very clear a mention of if the redirect URL of a request is wrong, don't send the user to that redirect URL, because that's a very clear problem. But there are some other cases that are less obvious about why they might be problems, and this was a attempt at describing and capturing those other situations that where you may not want to send the user away from the authorization server in the case of an error.
The way I understood it was that this is basically a trick that can be used to bypass spam filters and similar, lists of known bad redirectors, because you can, as a malicious developer, sign up for one OAuth development service, register your app, and register whatever redirect URL you want legitimately, because you own that particular application. And now you can send it to someone a link to that app that errors out on purpose, so that there is no gateway that will, no verification step. If someone clicks that URL, they will be redirected to the attacker redirect URI. And given that this thing, if a redirect comes from a domain, which is the identity provider domain, which is very likely not blocklisted by the browsers or by any mechanism you want, now you bypass the filter. Because if a filter would start blocking that stuff, then it would also block legitimate logins. And so this is basically a flavor of an open redirector, which is not really a security thing. Like, no one is stealing any tokens, no one is doing any elevation of privilege, but it is a very handy trick for skipping spam filters.
Yeah, interesting problem that I believe this has been seen in real life. Like, people are using this actively, which is why it's being brought up. I'm not going to name any names, but it's not really anybody's fault either. It's not like anybody's doing anything wrong here. And that's the question here, is like these OAuth servers are doing what's documented in the spec today. And is that something that maybe the spec shouldn't be recommending because of the possibility of being able to be used in this way? So this, like you said, it only applies to authorization servers that have a sort of more public way for developers to create apps on. So like, it does not apply to your own organization's private OAuth server where your admins make apps, because the only people who can make apps are your admins. And if your admins are getting tricked into registering redirect URLs for attackers, that's a different problem. But it does apply to things like, Twitter or GitHub, where they're just public identity providers and anybody can show up and make an app on them. And there's very little approval process, if any. And then you can use those URLs to in emails or SMSs where they don't get caught at that stage. So interesting question. And if I remember, the resolution on this was to document the situation, and Daniel was okay with adding it into the security BCP if it was relatively straightforward text that was being added. So rather than like recommending totally different behaviors, it was more just like pointing out the fact that this is a concern that some maybe you should be aware of. That was, I think, where we left it.
Like the thing is, there isn't much that can be done that wouldn't break things that are out there. Like the reason for which this thing is structured that way is that typically the authorization server doesn't have enough context to emit an experience that would make sense for the user. So if we were to say, you know what, we are not going to do this anymore, and now the burden would be on the authorization server to say, hey, this happened. This happened would probably be impenetrable from the developer perspective, and also returning an error so that the client could see not a 200 but an actual error, or not a 200, not a 302, but a 400 class error. And then at that point, it would be on the client to do something. You'd still have like a pretty significant breaking change. Like people would need to start managing that particular circumstance explicitly. Whereas today, whatever, you just come back and maybe you can resume the existing flow if a redirect, the return URL is not, it's a neutral one. So I think that the solution that the working group came to, which is documenting it, is a valid one, because the authorization server can always decide to do that anyway. And then at that point, if the circumstance apply, if the authorization server is like the ones that you described, one public one that decides that they don't want to do this, they can do whatever mitigation they think is most appropriate. You mentioned the curation. They might start saying, okay, before you can publish the app, some human need to look at it. I believe that's what happens with Facebook today. Like you actually, for certain claims, you need to ask for an approval process. Of course, it's expensive, so we cannot mandate it from the spec. But I think it's good that we remind people, hey, if you are worried about this particular circumstance, this is something that might happen.
Yep. So I think that was a good discussion. Good discussion of that. Went pretty well, and we'll see what comes out of that on the mailing list. I haven't seen any discussion of this yet. So
I haven't seen much of like a couple of ripples from the Depop last call, but in general, it seems like people like got an indigestion of interaction, and so now the mailing list is a bit slow. So whatever.
Yeah, need some time to recover from that much social interaction after 2 years.
Yeah, especially for us IT people, we tend to be introvert, extrovert, so like any combination. So
so then the last one for the day was OAuth 2.1, and we had more than 30 minutes left by that point, so got a nice good long chunk of discussion in on that.
It was fun.
It was some good stuff. The let's see, these are the minutes. The idea, so the way I usually do these is I try to give a recap of like what changed since the last time we've met, and then try to pull out a few discussion points worth talking about in the high bandwidth situation where everybody is, that are easier to do there than the mailing list, because the mailing list is open all the time for discussions, but some of these things are just easier to knock out in person. One of them was bringing in the ISS response parameter, since that was previously not an RFC and didn't seem appropriate to roll in, but now we agreed that it is appropriate now that it's an RFC to, at the very least, point out where it's relevant and reference out to the RFC. So that is on my list. the nice thing is that one, again, it flew through the RFC process because it is just such a simple mechanism and solves a specific problem that is not necessarily apply to everybody either. So it was very easy to sort of be like, this is a little box. Here it is. You are done. Yeah. A couple other good issues that we talked about. This one was interesting. I found text in the original OAuth spec that says access tokens have to have a limited lifetime. Bearer tokens must have a limited lifetime. And that it's in the core RFC. And I know for a fact that there are implementations of OAuth 2 that do not do this, that issue unlimited length access tokens. So that was my question was, how do we reconcile this? Because the real world does not reflect the document. So what do we do?
Yeah, it was a very good one, because I think that people conflated the need for something that verifies whether an access token should still be accepted without like granting that thing as a given forever, versus one tactic of enforcing that, which is to limit the expiration time of the access token. And the one thing that I said back in the day, and I still stand by it, is that today we have countless examples of continuous authentication in which we continuously assess the risk associated with a particular transaction, and we decide whether we are still okay with whatever the user or the caller did in order to prove their point that they have the right to access this resource, or whether instead we decided for any reason, like location, time elapsed, circumstances, time of the day, whatever, we don't know yet. This thing might decide, okay, I'm no longer okay with accepting this credential as something for giving you this service. I need you to do X, which can be something else. And you can happily do this with a token that has no formal end to its lifetime. Let's say that if for some reason people, before using the token, always does something that revises the session, then this is like a paper plane with people with a blowers under that keep this paper plane flying forever. Then the moment in which someone doesn't use the blower, it will drop down, but it doesn't matter. Like, it's not like you need to intrinsically place an expiration. Like I don't need to put a timer that makes the paper plane explode at some point because you've been in the air for too long. So, and I think that this was this kind of resonated with a room. Like people came from different angles, but the substance was that. Like we have other ways of deciding whether a token should be accepted or not, and the expiration is not the only way. And enforcing it would only result constraining people to have tokens that must expire will result in many non-compliant implementations. So that was the substance of the discussion, I think.
Yep, I agree. So I think it was turned out to be more about clarifying the intent of that statement in the spec, because if you read it quickly, it sounds like tokens have to have a scheduled expiration date in the future, which, as we discussed, is not the only way to have tokens become invalid later. So that was a good discussion. Yeah, it was, and I think that it's going to be a good clarification. This is one of the places where having OAuth 2.1 is objectively a good thing, because it gives us the opportunity to clarify something that for which very strong consensus on. Yep. So the biggest part of the discussion here was around the credentialed client.
Yeah.
This was right. Okay. I remember how this happened in the meeting. I had my list of issues that I pulled out to talk about with the group that I thought were relatively bite-sized chunks that we could have a good focus discussion on and come to a resolution of some sort. And it worked. It went great. We got through my list, and we still had like 15 minutes left during the of meeting time left, because we had kind of breezed through all that stuff in the beginning too. And Brian was there and pointed out that there was a discussion on the mailing list about credentialed clients, and then the discussion kind of just stopped, and nothing actually happened with that discussion. And honestly, I had completely forgotten about that entirely. So I was like, yeah, please, bring that, pop it back up on the list. And then we were like, well, why not just talk about it right now since we have time? So we did, and that ended up being another good discussion. So linked out to the pull up the mailing list thread about that happened previously. And yeah, so the quick backing up really quick. The idea with credentialed client was introducing a new term for a concept that already existed in the core spec, which was something between confidential clients and public clients. Confidential clients meaning you can have credentials, public clients meaning you can't. And then, however, there's other properties of confidential clients that are mentioned more often than just whether they have a secret. It's things like it's pre-registered, it's known, it's all these ideas tied up in it. And then in several places, there's this thing in the middle, which is an app has credentials, but you don't necessarily trust it with the same level of confidence as a confidential client. So the idea was to capture that as a name, but I think it ended up causing more confusion than it solved. So scrolling through the minutes on this is a treat, because I don't remember who took notes, but they took very good notes. And there's a lot of discussion that happened with this. So
yeah,
I like this one. David provided feedback from remote, which was inaudible.
It's very literal.
Yeah.
Also a bit concerned. No, I'm very concerned. But anyway, so here, like there's my summary of this thing. I think that some part of a group wanted a very simple, clear-cut definition, which says, if you have credentials, you are a confidential client. There is no doubt. And the thing is that from the OAuth perspective, I think that works. Let's say that if you're thinking as OAuth as like a algebra, that thing is a good operator, a good predicate on that algebra. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that for me, OAuth is a tool that people use, and they somewhat model reality using some of the primitives in this space. And reality has many other considerations that go beyond that particular detail. And in particular, to me, the main issue I have is that when OAuth was first conceived, the native and public clients were kind of like a afterthought, let's face it. Mm-hmm. Like the main thing was, I have a website which wants to talk about to another website, and it's going to do it on behalf of my user. So something with agency that it has its own independent identity, and all the little tricks were devised to support this flow so that this thing can do stuff on behalf of a user, even when the user is not present. Then, like many other things in identity, we took that thing and somewhat tortured it to also model scenarios with native clients, for example, situations in which distributing the key is complicated, protecting the key is complicated. But here is the part that people usually miss. The main difference between what we commonly think of as public clients and confidential clients is that there are many instances of the public clients. The public clients are things that run on my machine, on your phone, on his phone, on my watch, all of that stuff. And so when you use the client ID in there, you are just pointing to a set of configurations. You aren't really like doing anything serious from the security perspective. Anyone, apart from tricks on iOS for claim the domains and stuff like that, and Android, anyone can use that client ID. And so now, if we bring back, we say, okay, if anything that has a credential is a confidential client, now what happens is that if you have those flows in which you have multiple instances of apps running on different devices, and you somehow add the ability to provision a key afterwards, now all the machinery that was built for confidential clients might not work. Let's say that a lot of the assumptions there are, that's a website, it's a singleton, I have a list of users, it's a shared resource. Whereas the native client is, I'm the only one running it, apart from small situations like Outlook on a shared computer. But in general, there are many other considerations that are baked in the tools that people use for implementing OAuth in practice, because the goal is never to implement OAuth. The goal is to implement the scenario. It just happens to use OAuth. And so if now we bring back these consideration, I think that we owe to the world to explore what are the potential implications, as in like, now, am I going to have a lot of features about like concurrent users, which are useless when I'm building a native client? So maybe we just needed to find a stronger way of decoupling application types from client types, because they have different properties. But good luck with that, because like if you ever landed on the Auth0 page for developers, we have like a list of technologies like Angular, React, React Native, and similar. People click on the technology, and we have them in the path for actually getting the right choices from the auth perspective. If now you decouple client types from the application types, it becomes very, very tough. Like people need to be experts in identity. We can no longer make some of the work on their behalf. So I think it's a good discussion to have, but I'm worried about the long-ranging implications. And I'm worried that a lot of people involved in the discussion live at the protocol level, as opposed to actually see, perfect, that's the stuff that you're showing is exactly right. Instead of working with people that know nothing about this and helping people to be productive and effective when using those technologies. So I'm scared of this discussion because I know it's going to be difficult, and I'm worried that if a developer is not shielded by some of this stuff, we might end up making identity harder rather than easier. Whereas my hope is that we get to easier and easier layers rather than the opposite.
Yep, and we have the same thing on the Okta developer site as well. Of what kind of app are you building?
Yeah,
it's common, and I think for me, one of the things I've also been trying to help guide the Okta product in is decoupling the idea of whether the client is authenticating from the concept of PXE and from the concept of application type, because those traditionally, like in the older way of thinking about OAuth, all kind of came together as a package. Like you're building a single page app, that means it's a public client. There is no way it can authenticate. And it means you're doing the implicit flow. And then if you're building a mobile app, it means you can't authenticate. You're doing PXE, and right. There were these sort of bundles, and a lot of what we've been doing in the OAuth security space and the spec is to simplify that whole thing. And what it's doing is it's removing those bundles. And now it's just, if you're building an app, you should use the authorization code flow with PXE. If you can protect a secret, you should be using a secret. Those aren't related concepts. They're different concepts, right? So I've seen so much documentation in so many places that are like PXE or client secret. And those never were difference. They never were opposites. They just happen to often be bundled in different types of apps historically. So I think that's all kind of getting wrapped up in this idea too. And yeah,
it is very hard. It's very hard also because like we make security considerations, and if a customer does too, of course, but depending on the nature of a business, depending on the type of users and similar, there are a number of different considerations that also come into play. So sometimes when you're working with consumers, the funnel is the god of that particular company, in which if users don't go through the funnel, the company dies. And so that's where they have a different tolerance for like whether the user session is fresh or not fresh, whether they use the web often or whether they just use username and password, versus a company which instead has like employees or like a big value, like in which you do financial transactions and similar, in which the tolerance is different. And if we operate on the protocol level and project these to the customers, then we somehow flatten everything on the most secure side of the house, where unfortunately the effect sometimes is that people completely opt out. As in says, okay, this is impenetrable, it's just way too complicated for me, I'm just going to do something like completely custom, which completely break, we lose when that happened. Like when our stuff is so secure that no one can use it, we lose. So it is a difficult compromise. And I think that we have yet to crack the right angle, but the application type is one of the best defaults we can latch to. And although it's good to give optionality, like the classic, have a SPA, do I have a backend? Do I not have a backend? Can lead you in very different directions for what we said earlier. But sometimes that question is enough to turn off a lot of people that will just leave saying, I don't know what you're talking about. So I think that as we work to make this stuff usable and consumable by users, we'll need to maintain some flexibility that is not always the way in which we operate when we do those standards.
Yeah, definitely a challenging balancing act. Justin is here. Justin was at the meetings. Justin says, what we need is a clear idea of what a client ID actually means in OAuth, because it means like 3 or 4 very different things.
Yeah,
I think that's part of why this is becoming a difficult conversation, because yeah, it means certain things to different people. Certain people have grabbed onto particular meanings of it and hard-coded that in their systems, and what that means to everybody isn't always the same. So and that's why we're getting these differences of opinions of, oh, but a confidential client is just something that has a secret, versus, oh, we made a bunch of assumptions about confidential clients that have credentials that maybe you didn't. So you might be able to say that, but we can't. So there's all these, it does mean a bunch of different things.
it is tricky. We'll definitely need more clarity, if anything, so that at least we can classify things, as in like, given that those meanings were reverse engineered from practical use and people just took different angles and similar, we just needed to bring back some guidance, as in, okay, if you made this assumption, just know that those are the things that might go wrong. Like one of the classic most frustrating things I have is that occasionally someone discovers that they can reuse the client ID of a native client, and then they make a big deal saying, haha, I hacked this, I can look at this. And it's like, dude, it's by design. But it's surprising how many people think that the client ID is a secret, or it's kind of a secret. So yeah, clarity in there would be very useful.
Yep. Last thing on OAuth 2.1 before we move on, because we're almost out of time.
We need a second. We need a second episode.
Yeah, maybe we do.
Idea, because we covered only half of it. So
yeah, maybe that's a good plan. Do you have any plans to add the device flow to the 2.1 draft? Right now, there are no plans to actually like bring it in the same way that we brought in like actually incorporated a lot of the other documents, but there is a reference to it. So in in the draft, there's like, here are the grant types that defined by this draft, and here are like, you can make extensions to make other grant types. For example, the device grant. So I think that's probably where it's going to land. I don't think anybody's going to be very interested in actually bundling it in.
Yeah, I'd go even further and say that I think the future of the device grant is not as certain as it was until recently. Like in the
That's
second
an interesting
part,
point.
like in the second part of the meeting, at this point, like we can maybe mention, but then pick it up in the next episode.
Mhm.
Anyway, there are a number of constraints that come with doing these dual device flows that somehow are intrinsically vulnerable to phishing and similar attacks. And during the second meeting that we had that week with the OAuth working group, Peter from Microsoft and Daniel from Yes, and Philip from Auth0 all presented various circumstances in which device flow has been abused, and some general attacks for which like this thing is intrinsically vulnerable to. And it's kind of common to all the two device flows as they exist today. Like there is also the the OpenID SIOP 2 that has some of those characteristics, and SIBA might have something to that effect as well. So there are various thoughts about how some of those things can be mitigated. There are new things that are coming up, like the multi-device credential in FIDO, in which you can use like cloud-assisted Bluetooth. And so there is really no user interaction, and there is enforcing of co-location of the devices in the same volume of space. But the feature is unclear. And so although I don't think a device grant is going anywhere because it's so incredibly useful, but it does have limitations, and there might be better technology just behind the corner that might make it obsolete. So I think it's a wise course of action not to enshrine it in OAuth 2.1 because of all those considerations.
I think that's a very good point, especially because, again, OAuth 2.1 is supposed to simplify but also capture the best practice for OAuth. And if there's already concerns that this thing may not be the best, then we shouldn't package into the thing that we're saying is the best. So very good point. And that, I think, is a fantastic lead into the next episode of this, because that topic was one of the major blocks of time we spent on the second day. Really fascinating problem. And a lot of the side discussions were about that topic as well. So definitely deserves more time than we can get through right now. So Brian is telling us to step up and do another episode. So we will plan on doing that.
That's a pun, because one of the things that was presented was the step-up authentication that Brian and yours truly co-authored. So
yep, there it is. This was the agenda for the second day, and as you can see, lots of interesting topics there as well. Not to mention the side discussions we had. So yeah, we will do this again in the near future and talk about some of the other things that happened at the meeting.
Yeah, and we should do it actually pretty soon, because in a few weeks, then we will have conferences galore, because like the last week of April is IAW in Mountain View. The first week of May is the OAuth Security Workshop in Trondheim in Norway. I never know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but then it's true for pretty much anything that comes out of my mouth. I never know if I'm pronouncing stuff correctly. And then the week after, there will be the European Identity Conference in Berlin.
Oops, I forgot to put that one on here.
Bless the 3 weeks of a pause to try to get some work done. And then there will be RSA in San Francisco. another week, and then Identiverse. So I think that our carbon footprint is going to be interesting.
Agreed. My schedule, I'm not going to all of those, but I am going to, I should put EIC on this list, but I am going to the security workshop. The week after that is the EIC. So going to that, and then I will also be at Identiverse in June. Yeah, it's going to be a busy time. And then just right around the corner after that is the next IETF meeting in Philadelphia. So we have to make a lot of progress in 3 months to have more things to talk about there.
Oh,
So
yeah.
all of us
Or-
doc authors.
Or the opposite, as in so that we can just pick up saying, well, we didn't have time. Let's debate the same stuff again. No, of course, we need to find a way to make progress for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, good
Sounds
stuff.
like a very good stopping point. Unless there is some
I think
question.
so.
Do we have questions in the pipeline?
Nope. I think we covered everything. So
We put everyone to sleep.
Yeah, we didn't talk about Elon buying Twitter at all. So
oh yeah, all our insider information that we didn't share.
All right. This is, I forgot to have the little graphics on the screen. This has been the OAuth Happy Hour. Thanks for joining. We will post again the link out to the next one on events.oauth.net and the octadev.events website. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. And that is where you'll be able to find us in the future. So thanks, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Ciao a tutti. Ciao, ciao.